Hello and welcome to the Aquarius Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Reed. This episode of the Aquarius Podcast is sponsored by OASE. OASE is well known for their line of outdoor pond and water garden products and are now stepping into the indoor aquatics market. Their lineup includes products like the internal BioPlus filters and external Biomaster canister filters. Both lines of filtration offer models with heater integration to help you declutter your tank and show off your plants and fish. OASE also has a great selection of aquariums in their Biorb line. Their Biorb Cube aquarium actually won the award for Best Aquarium Product at the Super Zoo Trade Show. So check out these great products and more by clicking on the links in the show notes. Now, on to the interview. Today's date is Monday, May 13th, 2019. My guest today is Dr. Melissa Gibbs. Melissa is the Director of Aquatic and Marine Biology at Stetson University, located in Central Florida. Melissa's research includes areas such as spring fish ecology in Blue Springs State Park, armored catfish, and amphibian development biology. So, Melissa, welcome to the podcast.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you very much for taking time this Monday morning to chat with a fish nerd on hopefully what's going to be a variety of topics and really educational and informative to the audience, and especially myself, because I have been wanting to have somebody to come on and talk about, I don't want to jump straight into it, but I've been wanting somebody to come on and talk about what's happening with the manatee population in Florida, and in particular the impact that invasive armored catfish, and I'm going to butcher the scientific name, but Pterygoplicthes disjunctivus? How did I do?
Pterygoplicthes disjunctivus.
All right, close. But so so like the common pleco, right? The common pleco, the sailfin catfish, right?
It's similar. It's not actually a pleco. Pleco is short for Plecostomus, which is another genus of armored catfish, but they are very similar and they look an awful lot alike.
So in the trade, this isn't the common pleco then?
Well, I think that in the trade, the common pleco is now used to probably describe a lot of different species that all look very similar, but there are about 800 or so different species of loricariid armored catfish. So how many of those are included under the common pleco term or not, I'm not sure, but pleco is short for Plecostomus.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I know. So from doing Google Images, I mean, they pull up what would appear to be like some side-by-side comparisons of different species, and they all look very, very similar.
They do. They look very similar.
And just in particular, the vermiculated sailfin catfish, this one just happens to be the most abundant and is the one that's running the most rampant?
Right. So in Central Florida, there are 3 species of Pterygoplictes. There's disjunctivus, anisitsi, and multiradiatus, and they all look very similar. And I would be hard-pressed to identify, which was which, but we did figure out that in Blue Spring, at least, it's predominantly Pterygoplictes disjunctivus, but it probably is a blend. They probably are breeding. Crossbreeding and blending their genomes now that they're in the same place.
Interesting. Okay, so before we go too far down the meat and potatoes topic of this episode, which I'm super excited to do, let's talk a little bit about your backstory and how you got to this point of, one, it's super awesome to be the Director of Aquatic and Marine Biology at a university. I mean, that's really, really cool. But how did you get to this point? I guess, how did you get to, focusing on these particular research areas in academia?
So, working on armored catfish in particular, or how I got into being a marine biologist or an ichthyologist, which is really how I would describe myself.
Yeah, let's go the ichthyologist route, because you and I, we had a little bit of a talk, kind of pre-interview before we kick things off, and you are going to be unique in all the guests that I've had. In that you don't have the traditional like super fish nerd, fish room, multiple tank syndrome addiction like 55, 56 other people that I've interviewed has had.
Right. So I'm definitely a fish nerd, but yeah, not keeping tanks. So my dad's a biology professor, and so I was always interested in science. But watching National Geographic when they did an episode on the Galapagos Rift Zone when I was about 12, and at that point I decided, okay, I'm going to study deep sea fish. So it was deep sea and fish that were a passion, but loved fish from that point onward. I got my bachelor's degree in marine biology, studying deep sea fish, my master's degree in marine science, studying deep sea fish. And then by my PhD, I was studying sensory systems in goldfish, of all things. So I was keeping goldfish in the lab, doing brain surgery on them. And that gradually morphed into a postdoc studying sturgeon. And then I got to Florida for my first job and discovered the freshwater springs, which were just amazing, and realized that there'd been very little published on the fish that live in those springs. And soon after that, discovered the armored catfish living in the springs as well. And then I knew that I'd found something I could really sink my teeth into, because the armored catfish had not at that time at least been intensively studied. Their biology had not. So that's when I got started with armored catfish.
Mm-hmm. That's very cool. And just to kind of go back and pay a little homage to your previous research, was there anything, I mean, I guess what notable could you share about your research on goldfish?
So we discovered they do indeed have color vision. So we looked at areas of the brain that were responsible for color vision and for black and white vision. So I was kind of tying in brain anatomy to function. So I was recording electrical activity in their brains. And what I did discover with goldfish is that not all of them made good subjects for behavioral experiments, because some of them just did not cooperate. You could not train them to respond to flashes of light, and other ones were just fine. So probably some of your audience out there knows about goldfish having particular personalities or behavioral traits, but that was a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I know on the internet we like to call them the derp fish, and little kind of derpy guys. So now in my head, and in many people probably listening to this, when they think of a goldfish, they're thinking of maybe a fancy variety, a Ryukin, a Ranchu, I guess, but my assumption though would that be in the lab you're probably using more of a common goldfish, like a feeder fish?
Exactly.
Okay.
Common goldfish, yeah.
Okay. And then how about the sturgeon?
The sturgeon, we were looking at the development of the lateral line system. So kind of getting embryos and raising them up. And while we were doing that, we were able to map out how the lateral line system develops, so where it appears first and how the nerves innervate those lateral lines. So I was a neuroscientist for my PhD and for my postdoctoral position. So
yeah, and that was definitely one of the things I noticed was that your PhD was in neurobiology, which is like really cool.
It is. Now, most people are, when I was in my program, were using the fish and things to study the neurobiology, and I was using the neurobiology to study the fish. So again, I was still a fish nerd in those terms.
And then anything in particular with what you've researched in lateral lines on the sturgeon?
It would probably be pretty difficult to describe exactly what we did, but more or less, we mapped it out and got the timing down for it. But
gotcha. No, that's really, really awesome. And then moving forward then into the meat and potatoes of this, to talk about the armored catfish in Blue Springs. So you arrived in Florida first, correct?
Yes, got here in 1998 and started messing around in the springs in 99, 2000. And a colleague who likes to free dive in the spring said, oh yeah, we started seeing these armored catfish like the year before. And, we saw a few of them, and then the next year there were more, and they, kind of took off from there. And that's when I started to research them.
Mm-hmm. And now having gone to school for your bachelor's and master's programs in California, and then doing a PhD in Delaware, when I went to Florida, and people that listen to this know that the first thing I thought of when I go into the water, or actually the first thing I did when I got into the rental car and we're driving around, is I'm just assuming that there's alligators everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Now, when you started diving, I feel like you had to have had those same kind of feelings like I do, which Florida natives just kind of brush off, but I feel like that's a real thing, right? And did you feel the same thing?
Well, in the springs, the water is crystal clear, and so you can see whether or not there's an alligator in the water, if you're paying attention. We did get fairly unnerved initially by the manatees sneaking up on us, or suddenly the tarpon are surrounding us, or the gar that were almost as big as we were. But generally, we avoid the areas where the alligators might be hanging out. We've had a few close encounters. But generally it's been okay.
Oh my goodness! Now close encounter, like the alligators just kind of coming, taking a look at what's going on, and then swimming off?
No, it's more that when we've been sampling in areas of the spring run that are not open to the public, but when we have our permit to sample in areas of the spring run that are closer to the river, closer to the dark water, that we've had an encounter where we got a little too close to the dark water and startled an alligator, and it took off. And you can tell by the movement of the water whether it's an alligator taking off with its tail that goes side to side, or a manatee taking off and the tail goes up and down. So you get a different water pattern. And then when we've been hunting armored catfish with our pole spears, we had an encounter where a biologist, the park biologist, was actually going after a tilapia, missed it, hit a log instead, and right next to the log was a 6-foot gator. A 6-foot gator is too small to do anything to a human, but it was big enough on the eyes, so it startled the gator. Gator took off down the spring run, and all my brain allowed me to think was pterosaur, sturgeon, anything but alligator. But I think the alligator was more startled than we were.
6 foot or not, I mean, it could be a 3-foot object moving fast in the water, and I would be, my heart rate would definitely accelerate.
Yeah, definitely. And, the 6-foot gator, half of that is tail, so the body itself. But anyway, it was kind of exciting, yes.
I mean, I lived in San Diego for a little bit, and I used to kayak fish the La Jolla kelp beds. And so to go for white sea bass, we would launch very, very early in the morning, maybe like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. We're launching from the beach, and it's incredibly calm out there as you're paddling out, and you would have either California sea lions or maybe a different type of seal would come up, and they would breach, and you couldn't see them, but you could hear them. You could hear the noise, and you could hear the air. And for me, again, just kind of being very understanding that I'm not the apex predator when I'm just kind of floating on my kayak, immediately thinking it's like a great white shark that's going to breach and knock me on my kayak. Like, yes. I can definitely appreciate, the accelerated heart rate of when there's something, like when there's movement, when something's happening and you're not at the top of the food chain in that particular scenario. Like, it's very, very, very unnerving.
Yes, I think that's also why when we first started being out there, the manatees would freak us out sometimes because they'd sneak up on us, and they were just curious, but they did sneak up, and they're very, very large.
And they're huge. That would be so. I love manatees, right? Like the nickname is the sea cow, correct?
Yes.
So I love manatees. If I have the chance to go and see one in person, and I understand that there's interaction, right? Like the human interaction is like you don't touch them; you have to stay very, very far away.
Yes.
I think I'm applying some of my whale watching experiences to manatee watching. But I mean, they're incredibly majestic, and again, that's why I wanted to have somebody to come on and talk about what's occurring in Florida with the manatee populations. But yeah, they're massive, and to be crept up on one. I could definitely see how that would be a startling experience as well.
It definitely is, but it is very cool. There have been a few times when we've been manhandled by manatees, and yes, where they approach, we try to back off, and hopefully they'll go along their way. But every now and then, you get one that has had a lot of interaction with humans. Maybe it was rescued as a calf and raised at a wild animal park and then released again, but it's used to people, and so it can be kind of difficult sometimes to extract ourselves from a manatee.
I'm sorry. So is it like manatee bear hugging you?
Yeah, we've had that happen, or kind of yanking on our our arms, or we wear a shirt with our little Stetson crew information on it, and sometimes they'll yank on the shirt, or something like that. But they seem to be trying to get us to play with them, which of course we're not going to do. We're not going to touch them, and but they are very curious.
It's very hard to detach like just the like the young boy curiosity, fascination with just like wanting to bear hug a manatee with like, no, you can't do that. Like that's a wild animal. We need to respect them. But,
yes, yeah.
I mean, for them to initiate that engagement and to have that, split second or 2 seconds of like manatee bear hug or them playing with you is got to be like kind of a pure joy thing once you realize it's a manatee and not an alligator trying to death roll you.
Right. Although there was one manatee years ago who was extraordinarily friendly, and she taught her calves to also be friendly, and her name was Georgia, and she would chase us down the spring run, and whenever we stopped to do our sampling, she would not really slow down and kind of run right into us, again trying to interact with us. And with her, I had a moment thinking one time that as she's grabbing me and hugging me, that it almost seemed like she was trying to sit on me, and this could end badly.
Oh my goodness!
I mean, she never seemed aggressive, but you could see how if she was just kind of playing with me, knock you underwater.
Yeah. If she was bear hugging you and kind of kept you underwater for too long, that's not a good thing.
Yeah, and again, she just was interacting, seeming to be curious and wanting that human touch. But I was always glad that I was out there with a colleague, that you never go out sampling alone, and that's probably one of those reasons, just in case.
Oh my goodness, yeah, she probably thinks maybe you've got one of those giant milk bottles that she was used to, and if she was one of the rescued ones, right?
Yeah, and something like that, or just maybe got petted too many times when she was at the the Sea Park at SeaWorld or wherever she was. I can't remember which park.
Oh, wow. Yeah, just hearing you tell those stories and your experiences, I'm just running through episode titles of how I can title this thing with ran over a manatee or manatee bear hug. So I'm going to have to I'm going to have to work on episode titling, but you're giving me really good information, Melissa. That's awesome. So to go back, so we're in the late 90s. Colleague has introduced you to the Blue Springs, and you guys are noticing the increase in the armored catfish. So where do you go from there then in academia and in-field research?
So I started collecting armored catfish. We started catching them, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to do because they're benthic fish. So we tried using turtle grabbers, which are on a pole, and they've got kind of a little trigger on the end of it. So you kind of get it kind of cross their backs, almost like a saddle, and push down, and it kind of clamps on them a little bit. So we tried catching them that way with some success. We could grab them by hand initially, and then that started being a little more difficult. We started trying to use a mullet net, cast net underwater, kind of draping it over the fish, then porpoise down under and grab them out of the net. We tried using a bunch of different methods to catch them. And then what I was doing was collecting basic data of their length and their mass, and collecting their ovaries and testes, so I could start doing some reproductive studies, just some kind of basic life history information about them, because I wasn't able to find a lot about them. A few articles here and there, mostly out of Brazil, where they're native. A lot of things were or a number of things were in Portuguese, which I couldn't read. Some in German, which I sort of can. But there really wasn't a lot out there. So basic information, and collected data every year, throughout the year, trying to get things during the seasons of the year to see how things varied. And also kind of observing what the catfish were doing. So as we're sampling other fish in the spring run, we could see the catfish are air breathing, going up to the surface to breathe air, kind of seeing what their behavior was like on the benthos, where they were hanging out in the spring run, that sort of thing.
And benthic, to go back to that terminology, that's their a bottom dwelling, right?
Bottom dwelling,
okay.
Yes, associated with the bottom. So they're very flat. Generally, any fish that's very flat on its underside is a benthic fish. This it evolved to hang out flattened against the bottom, and that helps. And like in Blue Spring, very fast-flowing water, and so if you're on the bottom, sitting there on the bottom, then you don't have to exert too much energy to stay put.
Have you done any kind of cross collaboration with any peers in Brazil, or have you gone to Brazil to study them in their wild habitat?
I haven't either. I have not collaborated with anyone who's doing research in Brazil, nor have I been to Brazil.
Yeah, because I guess one assumption would be that in Brazil it's such a common thing, and it's such a I dare I say boring in Brazil that might not be a fish that they'd want to really research. But I guess for me, understanding and bucket list. Actually, I say bucket list, but 2020, I absolutely want to go to Peru and do a wild collecting trip, and go into the actual Peruvian Amazon and experience that. But knowing how the natives there catch that fish and seeing videos of when they go into these meat markets or fish markets that armored catfish are actually something that is a food fish down there. So understanding, how the natives there are catching the fish, and if there's any, maybe they're doing a technique that, although I think what we're going to get to is that you guys are probably using a fairly effective technique now with your harvesting of these guys, but that seems like it'd be a pretty cool experience. And then just to understand, like, as a food fish, possibly later in the conversation, but understanding if there's any possibilities for this thing being a food fish. So as far as research progression then, and I'm looking at your publications, and I love doing Google Scholar searches, and actually what's great about your page, and I'll have this link so people can check out the cool stuff that you've done. You've got a whole bunch of publications that you've authored or co-authored. How did your research and publications progress with this particular species?
Well, we started off with a reproduction study, and that was one where we collected data for a fairly long period of time, and then we started noticing with that first study that during the 3 years of data collection, that it looked like their reproductive patterns were changing.
And how
it
so?
Wasn't some. So, well, it looked like they were. When you look at reproductive patterns, you're looking at things like how many eggs do they lay. And how large are those eggs? And can you get a sense of how frequently they might spawn? Things like that. And those can all be used as measures of how successful that species is at reproducing. So, if you're looking at, what percentage of the body mass of a female is made up of ovaries, how much is she devoting of her energetic resources to reproduction? I mean, that will tell you a lot. So a fish that's doing really, really well in their ecosystem is going to be able to devote a lot more energy to reproduction than a fish that's not doing so well in its ecosystem. And fish that make very large eggs often are doing so because those embryos are going to need all that extra energy that's in the yolk of the egg to survive. But if the ecosystem is really benign or is really good for that fish, then they can afford to make less yolky eggs, smaller eggs. They can make more eggs, and those embryos are just as likely to survive as some other fish's big yolky eggs are.
Oh, wow.
So if you see fish going from starting to make more and more smaller eggs over time, they are adapting to their ecosystem. They're being more successful, and so that's what it looked like initially, was that these fish were starting to produce more eggs. And it also kind of looked like they were starting to spawn a little bit earlier each year, or at least their ovaries were what we call spawning ready, kind of ready to go at a moment's notice. But that first study, we didn't have enough data to say it was anything more than a trend. But I was intrigued. I thought this could be the beginning of something. And the reason this is so interesting is that invasive species, like armored catfish, are invasive because they're so very good at adapting to new ecosystems. That's how they end up being so successful.
Wow, and what's really cool about your research and the egg finding is that a video that was actually just put out a couple days ago or yesterday maybe on YouTube on the Aquarium Co-op channel. So Corey had gone to a fish farm in Central Florida, and this particular breeder is actually successful with clown loaches and a whole bunch of other Synodontis catfish. And one of the bits of information that the breeder shared was, when he gets his first generations, whether they're wild or from somebody else, the females, they don't have many eggs. And then as a few generations in, maybe 2 years in, 2 years worth of generations, the females start producing way more eggs. And it's, probably a comment, pointing to the research that you're talking about that you've done, is that maybe in his breeding facility, the females are more comfortable than where they came from previous breeding facilities, and they're just, it's a better environment for them, and they're devoting less to just overall survival, and they're able to pump more energy into that reproduction. So to actually hear you with your in-field scientific research back that up, or at least, we can have this kind of comparison on that statement that was made in the video, that's really cool.
Yes, no, exactly. That's exactly what happens. It's like whether you have to either devote energy to maintaining yourself, or you have enough excess energy to spare that you can devote that to your offspring. And then when you look at what you do as far as your offspring, you can either make a few very large eggs, or you can make a whole bunch of very small ones. And so we returned to the reproduction study 10 years after the beginning of the first one, and at that point we were able to collect enough data to show very clearly that there was a statistically significant change in their reproductive patterns, in their expansion of their breeding season, the number of eggs that they lay at a time, and the amount or the proportion of their body mass that's devoted to ovaries, which is the gonatosomatic index.
Oh, wow. Wow, there's an index for that.
Oh, yes. It's really just a measure of it's a proportion of the body mass.
Sure.
So the mass of the ovaries divided by the mass of the body multiplied by 100.
Oh, wow. See, that could also be an episode title right there. So, I mean, in my head, my comic head, like, they're at the point now where you just pick up a female and she just like spurts out eggs because, she's just like, that's just how things have changed for them.
It's practically that. I mean, they don't really start, spurting the eggs, but
sure,
but yeah,
sure.
it's
mild pressure.
It's a big difference, and I can pick up an armored catfish and make a pretty good guess about whether it's a male or a female based on its body shape if it's an adult. But
and so no wild no predators in the springs for these guys to predate on them and keep the population in check at all.
There are predators. I mean, if there are otters around, otters will eat them, or at least will eat a few bites of the tastiest parts of the catfish. But there aren't consistently otters living in the spring run. Alligators will eat them, but there aren't enough alligators. There's so many armored catfish that the predators that are out there, otters, alligators, when the catfish are little, birds can eat them, egrets and things like that. But once they reach a certain size, they can't be eaten by anything other than otters and gators, and there are just way too many of them.
Wow. So we've kind of painted the picture of, no real predators for these guys. The breeding is just, on this, dare I say, exponential kind of growth scale of, they're changing their physiology, and they're just be able to become so much more reproductively fertile. What else is happening then with these guys in the springs?
The other things really are how they're affecting other springs residents and how they're changing the springs ecosystem. Those are the other big deals, and that's where we get the interactions with manatees and where we get to the nutrient contributions, otherwise known as the poo factor, that we've been working on over the years.
Poop and fart jokes are perfectly fine on the Aquarius podcast.
Yes, yes. Well, this is something where, my publication is about abundant feces, but my colleague and I have always talked about it as the catfish poo. And this is something that we've been sampling in the spring run for 20 years, and I noticed while snorkeling around that there was a fair amount of stuff that looked kind of like spinach linguine on the bottom of the spring run. And I figured out pretty quickly that was armored catfish poo, and we weren't seeing poo from anything else in this other than manatees, but not seeing any other type of fecal material. Occasionally, you'd see some turtle feces, but this was kind of interesting to see all this catfish poo. And then I started wondering how much of it is out there. It looked like there was an awful lot. So we devised a way of studying this, of surveying catfish poo in the spring run. So got some PVC, made some little quadrats, and I spent a summer, or actually several summers, and actually several other sampling times throughout the year, but throwing these quadrats out and photographing wherever they landed and measuring the poo.
Huh. And so the quadrant, I thought where you were going with PVC was that you were going to like make little containers to scoop PVC or to scoop poo into the PVC. So what is the quadrant then?
The quadrant is just a square there's a known size, and so I used a 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter square of PVC, put a little gravel in there so it'll sink. And so I divided up the entire spring run with a grid so I could randomly sample the entire spring run. And I would lob the quadrat, let it settle on the benthos, and then I could use the GoPro to photograph that. And then with that area of a known size, I can have that on the computer and just kind of identify all of the pieces of poo and measure the length of them, and then I'd have the number, the number of centimeters of linear centimeters of poo per half meter square.
Okay, gotcha. And then as far as like chemical composition and whatnot, you were also sampling for that, or having analysis run on it.
Right. We also did some analysis on how much, what in the way of nutrients was leaching out of the poo, because there's a lot of it out there. So, for example, we estimated there's about on any given day 500,000 cubic centimeters of catfish poo in the spring run. That's a lot.
Yeah,
so,
once you start
kind
hitting
of
that 500,000,
mind-blowing, actually.
Wow.
But that's, and we figured that out by we had the linear, poo, and then we had measured the diameter, cross-sectional diameter of a strand of poo as well. But anyway, so what would be the effect of that poo sitting there in the spring run? It's got to be doing something. It's not going to be completely inert. Mm-hmm. And so we measured we looked at the nutrients that would be in the fecal material, so nitrates and total Kjeldahl nitrogen, phosphates, things like that, things that are normally in fertilizer. That's probably the simplest way to think about it. And we ran some experiments with little flumes and little artificial streams in the lab so that we could collect the water that had passed over the catfish poo, and we could see what nutrients were coming out, leaching out of the poo. And we found that it was leaching out nutrients. And even though the amount of nutrients coming out from any one sample of poo was fairly small, when you factored in the sheer amount of poo in the spring run, then we had a significant amount of nutrients that were being leached into the spring run by the armored catfish poo.
And so that seems to me like as a result of all these nutrients, then you would just have an explosion of plant growth, and you would just, not knowing what the Blue Springs. Although I feel like I've seen pictures of people diving in the Blue Springs, and it looks like they're always swimming over very, very lush beds of like a Vallisneria or some other type of like a water grass.
Right. We don't have any Vallisneria or any eelgrass in the Blue Spring Run. Other springs, I mean, it used to apparently, 40, 50 years ago, did have eelgrass, but it does not now. In fact, that's actually one of the issues for the manatees. But all we really have in Blue Spring is algae, and the algae is worse now than it was when we started, although we have not, because we were focused on fish when we first started working in the springs, we don't really have a baseline of our own for what the algae is like. But the algae situation in a lot of Florida springs has gotten worse, and the armored catfish certainly may be contributing to that. And armored catfish are eating algae, diatoms and filamentous algae, things like that. And it's not just them eating the algae that's in the spring run. Part of the problem is that they are also going out into the river, feeding there, and coming back into the spring run and pooping and leaving the nutrients in the spring run that are coming. They're bringing nutrients from the river back into the spring run. Mm-hmm. So they're adding.
So if they're only, in theory, if they're only eating the algae in the spring run itself, then potentially they would be resulting in a less net on the algae then. But the fact that they're bringing it in from the river and also pooping, they're then increasing the nutrient load and increasing the algae.
Exactly. And one of the kind of weird things that I noticed over the past 20 years of harvesting catfish that I can't really explain, but I've taken out over 8,000 catfish in the past, say, 15 years out of the spring run, and they used to be super common during the daytime, and then they started becoming less common during the daytime, as if somehow they had, not to anthropomorphize too much, but figured out that bad things happen during the daytime in the spring run, namely me harvesting catfish. So, but we really started noticing this around, say, 2005 or 6. But the amount of poo did not change. So I knew that the catfish were spending their days mostly out in the river, but coming into the spring run at night and eating algae and pooping in the spring run. So yes, they're definitely doing a lot of bringing nutrients back in to the spring.
But that could be a thing, though, right? Like behavioral evolution in a 2-decade span. Like if you're harvesting so many of their buddies, they're going to eventually learn that, man, that creature with the fins and that little pokey stick, like that, we should probably avoid her.
Yeah, I just don't know how much fish are learning. Mm-hmm. So that's where I have to say then somewhat tongue-in-cheek that they're figuring things out, because it's not like fish are going to be teaching their offspring, to avoid the predator. But something has changed. I just have not, don't have a good explanation for exactly how that behavioral change came to be. So you're always kind of, as a scientist, have to be kind of leery of who can learn, or what species can learn, and how exactly a behavioral change comes to be.
I guess I'm thinking, are you getting these guys, like when you're actually harvesting them with your pole arm mechanism, and I'm sure you probably actually have a name for it other than
we're using a pole spear now. We're using pole spears.
Okay. So when you're using a pole spear, are you? My guess is that there's always going to be groups of them, and so you're getting the one, and then the other ones are this fight or flight kind of experiences happening with them, or are you able to single them out and get them and pick them off, Navy SEAL assassin style, one at a time without any of their friends knowing?
Right. Well, it's funny because sometimes you'll see a bunch of fish together and you go after one and the other ones scatter. Other times you spear one and the others don't move. And you get the one fish off the spear, toss it in the canoe, and you can go right after the others. So yeah, there's quite a wide range of responses from the fish. Other times, you hit one, and it makes a pretty distinctive noise with the spear hitting the bone of the armor, and that noise will startle other ones some distance away, and they will take off. So, yeah, quite a variety of changes, the responses.
I mean, it could be a very, very, loose reach here or a stretch for me, but, in my neighborhood, there are constantly black-tailed deer. They are incredibly friendly. They come right up to me. I mean, I could probably get one within 2 feet and feed it an apple, where I know if you go out in the wild to actually hunt them, it's just, they're like a ghost. And so maybe, now granted, that's going to be more like 100 years of them being exposed to humans in this area versus, the 20 years of your experience and brain size of a deer versus brain size of an armored catfish. But it just feels like unless there's something like, increased amounts of sun because trees have been cut down along the springs, and so that's why they're coming in at nighttime, or increased daytime temperatures, or but then they're from Brazil where it's freaking super hot anyway.
Right, and I do think they are responding to the effect of humans hunting them. They absolutely are. I'm not enough of a fish behavioralist that I would want to venture into that.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, I took out 8,126 of them, according to my tally.
And
so
counting.
That's
nice.
a lot,
Are you like so please tell me you're like this crazy hitman where you actually get like a tattoo for every 1,000 plecos that you get like on your shoulder as like a badge?
No tattoos, but I do keep a tally on the whiteboard in my office, and I'm very proud of it.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, because by law in Florida, if you catch an invasive species, like you have to dispatch of it, correct? Or leave it where it can't go back into the water.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the law or not, but certainly we're very glad to take them out. Unfortunately, because there are so many of them in Florida, I mean, they're established as a species. We keep on taking them out, and they're going to keep on coming in from the river. But it feels pretty good to feel like you're doing something to help the native ecosystem and the manatees, even if it's kind of short term.
Yeah, because you're basically doing in freshwater now what people in saltwater have been doing with the lionfish.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Trying to plug a hole in the dike.
Yeah, although I hear that lionfish, they make excellent tacos. Where pleco, we have yet to check that out and see what.
Well, I've actually heard that. That people who do harvest them, people from Central America who harvest them in Central Florida, will kind of make a curry out of it, kind of chop it up. I think you have to kind of cook it in the shell, so to speak, because how are you going to skin an armored catfish? But just more or less that eating the tail section, that it's not bad eating.
Interesting.
And I've heard conflicting information about whether the roe is any good.
Oh, Melissa, I think you need to experiment. I think we need to get some culinary students in. And
sadly, I'm a vegetarian, so somebody else will have to experiment.
There you go. Well, we can. I'm sure at Stetson, there's got to be some type of a culinary program, right? That you can get some of those undergrad students to cook some up. So
far, nobody has expressed any interest in doing that here. So
here in Seattle, we call him Master Breeder Dean, and he's also he's like a jack of all trades. He's been in the hobby for years and years. He's bred all sorts of crazy things, caught fish in the wild. And Dean, I just absolutely love that guy. And he's also like a world trained, classically trained culinary chef. And so I think we need to get Dean some of these common, or I say common plecas, but we need to get Dean some of these armored catfish and see what he can come up with, because he's been down to Peru before, and I'm sure he's seen these guys in the market.
Probably.
So,
but yeah, I mean, usually when I was a master's student collecting deep sea fish, there always were some of the, particularly the male students who would look at whatever we'd hauled up in a deep water trawl and wonder if that would make some good cioppino. And didn't matter what it was, they always were wondering if that might be good to eat.
Dudes are just always hungry, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, but somehow none of my students here have ever expressed an interest in trying to eat it, and we're actually not allowed to eat anything that we capture in the state park
because of okay, it's not. because it's coming from the state park, or because you're
Because
there
it's coming,
for research?
Right, because it's coming from a state park, yes.
Oh,
and fishing is not allowed in a state park unless you're doing it with a scientific permit from Fish and Wildlife.
Gotcha. So I feel like an ichthyology student that has any passion for water or living creatures is going to love manatees and is going to want to take your classes and try to get out in the field with you. Like, that seems like a true statement.
Yes, I think it is. Students really do like getting out into the field. That's one of their favorite things about the classes that they take here. And yes, there's a great deal of interest in seeing the manatees or just spearing fish. I get people coming out of the woodwork wanting to help with armored catfish removal.
Yeah, and so before we jump back into a little bit more about manatees, like what are do you actually teach some of these courses, or are you purely research focused and kind of supporting the department?
I teach as well. We all teach at Stetson. So I teach a marine vertebrate biology course, for example, and we study manatees for that course as well. And I teach oceanography and introductory biology.
Okay, so that first course that you mentioned, that's the one that would get some students potentially going out into the field with you?
Yes, marine vertebrate biology would. And then all of our students have to do a kind of a capstone research project when they're a junior and a senior. And so we've had students, the publications I have that are studying manatees, that I had student co-authors. So students were doing their capstone project with the catfish manatee interactions.
That's excellent. I mean, I feel like I've done a decent amount of higher education, but I think I need to go and take a course at Stetson and get in the water with you. That sounds amazing. So going back to manatees and armored catfish. So now these guys are starting to interact, right? So the armored catfish, they're reproducing like crazy. They're pooping in the water. They're adding more algae into the Blue Spring Run. What is the interaction like with the manatees?
So I should set the stage a little bit with the manatees in Blue Spring. That Blue Spring is a constant 72, 73 degrees all year round. So when the river gets cold, then the spring becomes a thermal refuge for manatees. And the manatees may look like they're nice and fat and got plenty of blubber to keep them warm, but they don't. They have very little fat in their bodies at all, and so they're very susceptible to dying from cold shock. And so they will utilize warm refuges like springs or power plant outflows where it's nice and toasty warm, and stay warm in there. And then they need to make sure they also have a good food supply. But in Blue Spring, there is no eelgrass, which is their primary food. So there's nothing for them to eat in there. All they use Blue Spring for is to rest and stay warm. And what they are trying to do is stay as quiet as possible so they're not burning a lot of calories in the spring run. And then as soon as it gets sunny and warm during the day, they'll zip out into the river and eat there and then go back into the spring run to stay warm again. So the idea is to spend as much time staying quiet, conserving energy in the spring run, and as little time as possible out in the cold river eating. And that's where the catfish come into the equation, is that the catfish will start to graze the algae that's growing on the manatee's skin. Manatees have very rough skin, and so the algae can kind of take hold on their skin. And so the catfish are on there just using their little sucker mouths and little soft, bristly teeth to get that algae off. So they're not directly hurting the manatees by grazing. There's no wound or anything like that. But you may have seen pictures online where there might be 10, 20, 30, 40 catfish swarming all over a single manatee. So it's kind of horrifying sight. And what you'll see is all these catfish on the manatee, and the manatee then will kind of rise up off the bottom and maybe twitch a fin or flip the tail or something or roll. And the catfish will kind of come off of the manatee. The manatee will settle back down to the bottom, and the catfish will come all back down onto the manatee. And so it looked like, when we first noticed this, it looked like the catfish were really annoying the manatee. And so what we did was videotape the interactions, and we kind of quantified the different behaviors. So, giving a high number score to an active behavior, swimming fast by the manatee, or spinning along their long axis, and then gave very low numbers to snoozing or very slow-moving types of activities. And we found that manatee that had catfish on them were significantly more active than manatee that did not have catfish attached to them. Mm-hmm. And that means then that manatee with catfish on them are more active. They're burning more calories in the spring run. And so then they're going to have to go out into the cold river to feed more frequently. And that means they're much more likely to experience cold shock and potentially die because they've been disturbed by the catfish.
Oh, wow. So how about sleep deprivation as well? Like, are they trying to sleep in the Blue Springs?
Yeah, they spend a lot of time resting, and so it probably is a component of the being disturbed. They're in general, manatee will do a lot of kind of napping. Mm-hmm. Because they have to come up to breathe. Then they're never, completely out. But they will nap and then come up, for air maybe every 20 minutes or something like that. But they're definitely not able to rest. And if you're not resting, you're probably not sleeping as much, and you're definitely burning a lot more calories.
Yeah, because in my head it's like, all right, summertime, or you're in the shade, you're on a hammock, pretend you're in a Speedo and you're trying to get rest, and all of a sudden you've got 100 little flies on you. And every 10 seconds you have to like twitch yourself. Like, you're not going to be able to get a deep state of sleep. You're not going to get rest. You're not going to hit your REM cycle. So, just trying to draw that, that connection to a manatee then with this same kind of situation of the suckermouth catfish, which are probably, I don't know if they've got thicker skin. Maybe it's a similar sensation, but like, that'd get real old real fast, and I feel like I wouldn't be able to get any rest. And so you're burning calories, you're more susceptible to sickness, and then you're just that irritated, sleep deprivation. And after a while, that just gets dangerous.
Right, and I don't know anything really about sleep patterns in manatee, so I don't know that they have REM sleep, or if they get irritable, things like that.
Sure,
but they definitely the energetic balance has changed, and the really dangerous thing for manatees is that you could probably list maybe we'll just say 5 or 6 different major kind of stress factors for them. And instead of the stress factors adding up for manatees as far as the risk to their health, they don't add up, they multiply. So anytime you put an additional risk factor in there, it's making their situation a lot more dire than it would if you were just adding another risk factor in.
What is their classification right now for the manatee? Their endangered classification?
I believe they're threatened. That they downlisted them. The populations have been going up.
Oh, good.
But the problem is we don't really know what a healthy population should be. It certainly has gone up wonderfully over the past 30, 40 years. But what is healthy? Is 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, is that enough to maintain a healthy, genetically healthy population of manatees? Maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Now, what percentage of manatees would you say utilize Blue Springs as a refuge for the colder season in relation to the larger population?
Well, there are about, I think, 500 manatees, 500 and something, 20 manatees, I think, is the largest number of manatees that have been in Blue Spring at any one time. I don't know the size of the population that lives in the St. Johns River, which is a fairly distinct population from those that are mostly out in the ocean. The West Indian manatee has a Florida subspecies, and then the that subspecies has several populations where there are a whole bunch of manatees that spend most of their lives in the St. Johns River, but they will go out into the ocean, right? So there are probably there could be a couple hundred more manatees beyond that 520 that occasionally show up in the spring run, but it's a good number of them in Blue Spring. They've been doing very well in this part of the St. Johns drainage.
And then, of course, the fear is that if they're not already there, these armored catfish would just spread out through the rest of the manatees' habitats, right? So it's not just Blue Springs. It's did you say it was the St. Johns?
Right, the St. Johns River. They're throughout the St. Johns River. They're throughout Florida. They're everywhere.
Oh, okay.
They've already established themselves everywhere.
And so, how's the partnership been with like the Florida legislative body, Florida, Department of Fish and Wildlife or Natural Resources or whatever that department is called in your state, as a partner in this effort?
Well, certainly working with the park system. The Department of Environmental Protection, which is where I get the permits, that's all been great. Working with the St. Johns River Water Management District, that's also been really good. And we certainly are heartened by what looks like some real movement in protecting freshwater springs by the state government. So we'll see. It's a constant battle with the needs or the wants of people for fresh water, both for drinking, for irrigation, for recreation, and then balancing that with a healthy ecosystem.
And as far as what we could be doing as a public or as the agency bodies to help combat the armored catfish in the Blue Springs State Park, because it from reading an article this year, it sounds like it's an incredibly compressed time window of when you're able to go in there and actually spear these guys.
Right, so that generally we don't go in there during the manatee season, which is mid-November to mid-March, because there are so many manatees in the spring run that it's just too much of a risk. So the things that people can do, and we need to really get the message out there that if you have these fish in fish tanks, and they get too big for the tank, or you don't want it anymore, that you do not let it go in the wild. You may not want the fish to die. Maybe you don't want to put it down for the long nap in the freezer, or find a place to give it away. But the damage that these things can do to native ecosystems are really pretty impressive. And so we need to stop releasing exotic species. And then the other thing is that we're not going to be able to get rid of armored catfish. Right? They're here to stay because they've established themselves. But we can do other things that will help to protect native species, like manatees, for example. Speed zones on the river may not be super popular with boaters, but that is something we can control. We can control how fast we're going in the river and how many boat strikes there are. Manatees die pretty frequently from being run over by boats. We can control that. We can't control the armored catfish being here, but we can control some of these other human risks to native species.
And do we tend to find the boat strikes, like are they occurring in popular recreation areas where we've got people that are wakeboarding or water skiing, or are they happening more in kind of compressed areas where maybe it's like a guy on a bass boat or something like that?
I suspect it's mostly people people don't tend to water ski in the St. Johns, so I think it's mostly people who are just out boating, fishing, or just going out for a boat ride, but they want to go fast. People like to go fast. I can understand that desire, but we've got these slow-moving mammals that are pretty unique to Florida, and we really just have to protect them.
And as far as is there an opportunity for the public to, outside of the springs, to be more active in, again, being like the lionfish populations in on the coast, to be more active in spearfishing for these particular catfish? Like, is that something where that'd be kind of nice, like how they're going out for the pythons in the Everglades? They're it sounds like any old citizen can jump in their truck and go look for pythons, which my hat's off to you, because pythons are scary.
Right. No, it's an appealing idea, but the problem is that the St. Johns River is a black water system.
Oh.
So it's dark.
Yeah.
And we've got an awful lot of alligators. So yeah. there's no snorkeling in the river. You really and because they're herbivores, it's highly unlikely you'd get it to take any kind of bait. But yeah, in some shallow water areas, you'd be able to see well enough to spear from shore, but it's not very practical. I'd heard of some years back, some people were trying to harvest them for fish meal fertilizer, but using nets. But there's so many snags, big trees and things are down in the river. They get caught up on that, and armored catfish, when they kind of lock their fins in place, they are kind of difficult, rough on nets as well, and hard to get out. So that I don't think lasted very long.
Wow, so then nothing like the invasive carp then, that you're kind of able to just go out on a boat in a river and just take your net and scoop up dozens and dozens of carp. It's a much trickier game to go after.
Exactly, and I guess with some of these carp, I guess it's a silver carp. All you have to do is run your engine, and they're going to start leaping out of the water.
And they freaking hurt you, I guess, right? They're like 40-pound fish, and you're smashing into it at 20 miles an hour.
Yeah, they can do some damage.
So there you go. Now you're going to kill me for this, but let's introduce that silver carp into your St. John's, and then that'll stop people from going fast.
Right, yeah.
No, we will not do that. The Aquarius Podcast does not support releasing invasive species into waterways, so please don't do that.
Right, yeah. And some people will think, I actually had somebody tell me that they were going to, they thought they should be releasing more of these armored catfish into Blue Spring because they knew that they were often used as algae eaters in fish tanks. They knew we were taking them out, and she thought that we should be putting more of them back in instead. And it's like, no. They may be eating the algae, but they're pooping it right back out again, and so that's not going to help.
I hope that was just kind of like an average John off the street, not like a credentialed academic, right?
Correct. Okay. Definitely not an academic. Just somebody who wanted to do the best thing for the spring, but really didn't understand the concept of what the fish were doing and what we try to do for natural ecosystems.
Yeah, I'm not one to step in and tell people how to run their business, but I would really hope that some of the fish farms or people that are still importing these particular species, which I know Brazil clamps down pretty hard on what you can import now, but I don't necessarily think that this particular type of this genus or this the one of 3 species of these kinds of invasive catfish are on that ban list. But I would hope that our U.S. based importers are conscious of what is happening and realize that this is kind of a blight on the tropical fish hobby, and that this is something that could draw a lot of negative attention, and that they would self-govern and stop breeding and importing this particular species of fish. Like that would be. You're
jesting, right?
I mean, that would be my hope, right? Because
that would be a wonderful thing. But have we seen that happen yet in the pet trade? Where
I know. Like, so I would venture to guess that almost everybody that listens to my podcast would know. Yep, armored catfish, common plecos. Those get massive. I don't want those in my tank. Yep. When I first got into the hobby, I had one, but I don't anymore.
Yeah,
it's unfortunately it's the families that go into a pet. I don't even want to drop their names, but a big box fish store where these things are commonly sold, and the staff isn't as well versed and they're not as trained. They may be in guinea pig land one day and covering in aquatics the next. It's like, oh yeah, that's the cleaner fish. You always need one of those. I just really hope that they would see that there's negative attention being drawn. Right, the manatee is a treasured and beloved just goofball creature that wants to hug you in the water for the most part. Like, we need to protect that. And, if this course continues, like, you don't want to draw negative attention to yourself, right? Like, people already say that the tropical fish hobby is in somewhat of a decline and that things aren't as great as they used to be decades ago. So why further a negative on your industry, right? Like, why bring this negative stigma on you? So maybe we self-govern, maybe we stop selling that fish, maybe we go a little bit deeper on guppies and maybe some of the smaller loricariid species. I don't know.
Yeah. No, so. I think that there are a lot of people who are into the aquarium trade who are very responsible and understand the situation that can occur when you get a species that goes invasive. But I think that it would take a very long time to ever really get a grip on the import of a lot of species, of really figuring out first, before you start importing it, let's find out if it has any invasive tendencies. And then there are a lot of these fish, are probably being collected locally, that they're doing well enough here that I bet a lot of the pet stores are getting their armored catfish from local collectors.
Oh, wow.
Collect the eggs and then hatch them and, or get them fish farms and things like that. I doubt that a lot of them are being imported.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't think of that. But for the most part, though, I mean, it's an unfortunate thing, but this is kind of exclusive to just Florida, right? As far as you guys have the right conditions for most of these tropical fish, or are they able to survive in Louisiana or Georgia or somewhere that maybe like a South Carolina? I'm a little bit rusty on my Southeast U.S. geography right now.
No, they're in South Carolina. It's Pamlico Sound. I've read of them there. They're throughout the Southeast. I've read about them in Texas, like in the Houston area, going from bayou to bayou. So they clearly have some tolerance for salt. They're in in the Caribbean, like Puerto Rico, I know has them. They're big in the Philippines, Taiwan. They're in India. They're kind of spreading all over the place. But, in the U.S., yes, Florida and Hawaii, which also has them, are the ones that have the worst invasive species issues.
Wow. Yeah, and that's part of the whole reason of, me wanting to have somebody on to talk about this situation is that, I love this hobby and I want to see it thrive, and I want to see everybody in the hobby make, whether you're a consumer, you're a hobbyist, or you're actually an importer or a breeder, that we all make smart decisions and we all think about the implications of our decisions. And that goes to selling stuff, right? Like, if you're going to sell something, think about what could potentially happen if this gets out in the wild. Like, is it something that's just going to flounder and die because it has to survive in 95-degree water that's, it has a pH of 10? Or is it something that, man, if it got out in, the southeastern, United States would potentially be a perfect home for this? And unfortunately, I think this is probably one of those things where it's hindsight's 2020, that, you'd have to have a lot of foresight to have known that this kind of fish was going to wreak such havoc on the chemical composition of water and algae blooms and harassment of manatees.
Oh, absolutely. It's very difficult to predict things like that. Yeah.
But that being said, if you're importing gigantic snakes, if you're, bringing in reptiles and, you're breeding fish, especially if you're in Florida, I don't know, like, make sure that you're educating as best you can, educate yourself on what you bring in, protect against the hurricanes, right? Because hurricanes, they come in and they flood, and then these fish pens get flooded, right? And then they all somehow end up in the natural waterways. That's one of the ways that these things have gotten out as well.
Exactly, and they can travel cross country on their own too if it's really wet. So. Oh wow. Yeah, because they can air breathe and they've got those stiff pectoral fins. They can. They're not walking catfish, but they can sort of walk.
Mm-hmm. So Melissa, that's craziness. So Melissa, thank you very much for coming on, and I'm going to make sure I've got a link to Stetson University if people want to check out what your university is all about. I'll have a link to your faculty page as well. Are there any other online resources, any particular videos, or any articles that you would like me to link as well, or that you'd like listeners to know about?
I probably could send you some. There was something that the Orlando Sentinel did a couple of weeks ago that was fairly entertaining description of what we do out in the spring run. But I think that you've managed to find most of the things that I think that
I was internet stalking before the episode, so
yes.
Well, Melissa,
but no, I certainly enjoyed being on the podcast. So,
no, awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, people are.
You're welcome.
Yeah, people are definitely going to get a kick out of this episode, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.